The morning air in Reykjavik tasted like iron and salt. It was late September, and the sky hung low over the city, a bruised gray that promised nothing good. But Marcus Chen didn't notice. He was too busy checking his equipment for the 100th time, running his fingers along the carabiners clipped to his climbing harness, testing the tension on his crampons. At 34, he had summited peaks on 4 continents. He had navigated crevasse fields in the Swiss Alps, rappelled down frozen waterfalls in Canada, and spent more nights sleeping on ice than in his own apartment in Seattle. Experience, he believed, was the best insurance policy money could buy. His phone buzzed on the hotel nightstand. A message from Sarah. "Be careful out there." 3 words. Marcus smiled and didn't respond. Careful was for people who doubted themselves. The team assembled at dawn outside a converted farmhouse 2 hours northeast of the capital. The glacier they were targeting was Vatnajökull, one of Europe's largest ice sheets, sprawling across nearly 3,000 square kilometers of eastern Iceland. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, a vast undulating expanse of white and pale blue, sculpted by wind and time into formations that looked simultaneously ancient and alive. Marcus had chosen this particular route because it wasn't the standard tourist track. The standard track meant crowds, meant controlled environments, meant boring. He had assembled his team with that philosophy in mind. People who understood that real adventure lived in the margins. There were 4 of them. Marcus, the leader. Jonas, a Danish mountaineer with sharp blue eyes and a habit of quiet competence that masked a reckless streak a mile wide. Elena, a climbing photographer from Barcelona who had worked with National Geographic and possessed the kind of calm under pressure that made her invaluable. And David, the youngest at 26, a geology student from Reykjavik who had joined them just 2 weeks earlier through a mountaineering forum, and who carried himself with the nervousness of someone still proving he belonged. The local guide they had hired was named Gunnar. He was 63, weathered like driftwood, with the kind of face that came from decades of living on an island that didn't forgive mistakes. Gunnar had tried to warn them. He had done so the previous evening when they had met to finalize logistics at a small cafe in the town of Huffen, about an hour's drive from the glacier. Gunnar had placed a map on the table between the espresso cups and said that the season was closing. Late September meant unpredictable conditions. The freeze-thaw cycles were becoming erratic. The ice bridge that would allow them safe passage across the main crevasse field, the one Marcus had identified as their key entry point, was thinner than it had been 2 weeks ago. Gunnar had pointed to a section of the glacier with his weathered finger and explained, his Icelandic accent, making each word deliberate and heavy, that 3 years earlier, a hiking group had fallen through a similar section. 1 of them had died. 2 had survived, but with serious injuries that would have been far worse if they hadn't been in a populated area with rescue teams nearby. Marcus had listened politely. He had nodded at the appropriate moments, but he had also noticed that Gunnar was old, that his climbing days were probably behind him, and that fear was a natural companion to age. Marcus had explained to the group afterward that Gunnar had simply been risk-averse, that his experience was valuable, but his caution was outdated. The ice conditions weren't worse, Marcus had said. They were just different, and different was manageable if you stayed alert. Now, as the 4 of them descended from their small camp into the glacier's interior, Marcus felt the familiar rush of certainty that always came when he was on ice. The crampons bit into the surface with satisfying metallic clinks. The rope connecting the 4 of them moved in smooth synchronization. The light was already beginning to shift. At this latitude, in late September, darkness came early, and with a finality that felt almost personal. But they had time. Marcus had calculated everything. They would descend for 4 hours, establish camp in a sheltered crevasse formation about 300 meters down, spend the night, and then continue deeper the next day. The ice beneath them was a palette of blues and whites. Here and there, darker striations ran through it, layers of ash from volcanic eruptions years or decades before. The air was still, but there was a quality to that stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like holding your breath. Sounds carried strangely across the ice, the scrape of their equipment, their breathing, the faint crack of ice settling under the weight of millions of tons of accumulated snow and compressed time. It was beautiful and wrong in equal measure. They had been descending for 40 minutes when Jonas pointed out the first problem. The crevasse field Marcus had planned to skirt around was wider than the satellite images had suggested. What should have been a narrow gap, 3 meters, maybe 4, was at least 8 meters across, and it was impossible to tell how deep it went. The walls of ice on either side disappeared into shadow and mist. Marcus consulted the printed map he had brought, comparing it to the landscape in front of them. The map was from a university. Publication updated 2 years prior. The glacier moved, but not that much, not that quickly. He proposed a detour, move west, where the crevasse appeared narrower, attempt a crossing there. Elena suggested they rope up more tightly. Jonas asked if they should turn back and reassess. David said nothing, but his breathing had become audible through his mask. They moved west. The ice became rougher, broken into a maze of small seracs, fractured columns of ice that looked like a frozen city in a miniature, beautiful, and treacherous. Marcus picked a path through them, moving slowly, testing each surface before committing his weight. The others followed, maintaining rope tension, moving as one organism. This was what climbing was, not the triumph of reaching summits, but these moments of acute focus where every decision mattered. The crevasse they eventually came to was narrower, maybe 5 meters. Marcus identified a section where the edges had collapsed inward, creating a natural ramp of ice debris. He dropped an ice screw into the wall opposite, set an anchor, and then, with the rope secured, made his way across the debris field. It was treacherous. Loose ice chunks shifted under his weight, but it held. He called for Jonas to follow. Jonas came smoothly, moving like someone who had done this hundreds of times, which he had. Elena crossed with the careful deliberation of someone who understood exactly how much danger she was in. David came last, and just as his feet landed on the far side, one of the ice chunks they had crossed shifted beneath him. He stumbled, caught himself, and looked back at the crevasse with the expression of someone who had just glimpsed their own death and found it staring back. No one spoke about it. They didn't discuss the near miss. In climbing culture, you acknowledged a problem by addressing it, not by discussing it. You moved forward. You stayed focused. Fear was something you encountered and set aside, like a rock in your path that you stepped over without looking back. By the time they reached the area where Marcus had planned to establish camp, the light had changed completely. The sun was above the horizon still, technically, but only barely, a pale disk hanging in a sky that was already beginning to darken toward purple. This far north, at this time of year, twilight lasted nearly as long as full night. It was a state of being caught between states, neither light nor darkness, neither day nor night, existing in an in-between that made time feel negotiable. The sheltered crevasse Marcus had identified from satellite imagery turned out to be less sheltered than hoped. The walls curved at odd angles, and wind funneled through it with a sound like something living and angry. But they had descended far enough that turning back made no sense. They set up their emergency shelters, lightweight tents designed for exactly this purpose, though shelter was a generous description for fabric and aluminum poles, stretched over the void. Marcus anchored everything with ice screws, doubling and tripling the security. They connected themselves to the anchors with carabiners and rope. If the wind wanted them, it would have to work for it. Elena prepared hot food on a small camping stove, while the others arranged their sleeping bags and equipment. No one was particularly hungry, but eating was important. Eating was energy. Eating was survival. Elena's hands were steady as she stirred the dehydrated pasta, and Marcus found himself grateful for that. There was something calming about watching someone perform a mundane task competently, even in the middle of a glacier in the darkness. Jonas asked what the plan was for tomorrow. Marcus explained that they would continue deeper, following the path he had mapped. The goal was to reach a particular feature, a massive ice formation that Elena wanted to photograph, and that Marcus found scientifically interesting. They would spend time there documenting it, then begin the ascent back out. Everything was planned. Everything was controlled. David asked if Gunnar's warnings meant anything. The question hung in the thin air between the tents. Marcus explained that Gunnar was old, that he had grown up with a different understanding of these glaciers, that climate change meant conditions shifted faster than local lore could account for. David nodded, accepting this explanation, but something in his expression suggested he was filing the question away for later consideration. They slept poorly. The sound of wind and settling ice meant that rest was never quite complete. Several times during the night, Marcus found himself awake, lying in his sleeping bag, listening to the glacier breathe around him. There were noises that made sense. Wind, ice shifting under thermal stress. And then there were other noises. sounds that seemed to come from no particular direction, that seemed to echo up from deep within the ice itself. Once, around what Marcus guessed was 3 in the morning, there was a sound like a massive sheet of metal being torn, distant enough that it posed no immediate threat, but close enough that everyone heard it and woke, and close enough that no one asked what it was. Morning, or what passed for morning, came with a lessening of darkness. The sun touched the horizon again, same position as yesterday, same pale and distant quality. The team packed quickly, efficiently, moving through the familiar rituals of preparation, without speaking much. The cold had settled into everything. Marcus's fingers felt thick and slow inside his gloves. His face was numb despite the balaclava. The thermometer on his equipment showed -18°C. They descended deeper into the glacier. The terrain began to change. The ice became less uniform, broken by more extensive crevasse fields, by sections where the surface had collapsed inward, creating pits that opened onto darkness. Marcus navigated around these obstacles, working from his mental map and from the visual evidence in front of him, adjusting route constantly. The GPS should have helped, but the glacier environment played havoc with signals. Several times the device went haywire, showing positions that were clearly wrong, displaying topographic features that didn't match what they could see. By midday, if you could call the perpetual gray-purple light midday, they reached a section where the route forward became genuinely unclear. The terrain Marcus had planned to traverse was visible on the satellite images from 2 years ago, but the glacier had reorganized itself. What should have been a slope was now a series of broken blocks. What should have been passable was now blocked by a crevasse that seemed to split the entire width of the glacier, a massive fracture that extended beyond their ability to see in both directions. Jonas suggested they climb up, try to get higher on the glacier where the terrain might be more stable. Elena suggested they retreat, reassess, perhaps wait for better conditions and try again in spring when they could bring more equipment, more support, better intelligence. David said nothing, but his breathing was audible again, his anxiety bleeding into the rope tension in a way that made Marcus aware the younger climber was reaching the edge of his psychological reserves. Marcus decided to climb. To retreat would mean admitting that the conditions were worse than expected, that Gunnar had a point, that perhaps experience alone wasn't enough to navigate this particular situation. Marcus refused to make that admission, even internally. So they climbed, ascending a steep slope of consolidated snow and ice, moving toward the ridge of a serac formation that appeared to offer a view of what lay ahead. The climb took an hour. The higher they went, the more pronounced the wind became. It howled across the surface, carrying ice crystals that felt like needles against exposed skin. From the top of the serac, they could see across the glacier in all directions. What they saw was a landscape that had transformed completely from Marcus's planning documents. The glacier's surface had collapsed in multiple places. New crevasse fields had opened. The entire central section they had intended to traverse was now a maze of ice blocks and shadows. Elena expressed what everyone was thinking. She said that the glacier had become unstable, that something was happening beneath the surface, that perhaps they should reconsider whether continuing deeper made any sense. Marcus responded by pointing toward a feature further down the ice, a massive formation that rose almost like a cathedral, pale blue against the gray. He said that was their destination, that the detour would add time, but was navigable, that retreat wasn't an option, because to retreat would mean wasting the time they had invested, wasting the money they had spent, wasting the opportunity they might never have again. The decision was made not with agreement, but with silence. The silence of people who understood that returning to this conversation would be futile, who had decided that following the designated leader was easier than resisting him. They descended back down into the crevasse field maze. Progress became measured in meters instead of kilometers. Every step required assessment. Every shadow could hide danger. The rope connecting them became a constant reminder that they were dependent on each other, that a single mistake by one person could pull all 4 of them into darkness. Around what Marcus estimated was late afternoon, David's crampon caught on ice. He stumbled. The rope connecting the 4 of them went taut with sudden force. For a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Everyone froze. David recovered, regained his balance, stepped away from the small crevasse his foot had caught, and continued forward. Jonas said David's name, checking that he was okay. David said he was fine. He was fine. He was fine, repeating it like a prayer. They began to move faster. Not recklessly, but faster than the terrain truly warranted. There was an unspoken understanding that they needed to reach the ice formation Marcus had identified before darkness became complete. The light was already fading toward something that could no longer be called twilight, something that was edging closer to true night. The formation loomed larger as they approached. Up close, it was even more impressive. A cathedral of blue ice, hundreds of meters tall, sculpted by wind and time into shapes that suggested intention, even though there was nothing intentional about it. Nothing but physics and accident and the indifferent beauty of a glacier reorganizing itself. Elena immediately began setting up her camera equipment, working quickly with the efficiency of someone who understood that the light was burning away, and she had moments, not hours. Jonas began preparing a place where they could shelter for the night. Marcus stood at the edge of the formation, studying the landscape below them, looking at the path ahead. It was David who noticed the sound first. He pointed down into the crevasse field they had just traversed, and when everyone stopped to listen, they all heard it. A deep groaning, like the earth was waking up, like something vast was shifting. It wasn't a single sound, but a series of sounds, connected, resonating through the ice with a quality that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Jonas asked what it was. Marcus said it was settling, the glacier moving under thermal stress, adjusting to the temperature fluctuations. It was normal. It was expected. It was nothing to worry about. But as the sound continued, deeper and more resonant, Elena pointed to the crevasse field they had just traveled through. The ground was moving, not visibly, not dramatically, but moving nonetheless, a subtle shifting that was somehow more terrifying than dramatic collapse would have been, because it was so fundamental, so absolute. The earth wasn't supposed to move, but here it was, moving, rearranging itself, erasing the paths they had taken, making their descent route disappear behind them. Marcus studied the landscape with intensity, his mind working through scenarios. They could stay here, wait for the glacier to settle, continue in the morning, or they could continue forward, descend further, reach the lower section of the glacier where the ice was more stable. The second option meant navigating in near-total darkness, meant pushing when they were already fatigued, meant increasing the risk profile significantly. Jonas asked directly if they should go down or wait. The question was addressed to Marcus. The decision was Marcus's to make. Marcus said they would continue. There was still enough light, he said. They could make progress. They could reach the lower section where conditions would be more stable. Elena packed her camera without argument. David assembled, his equipment with hands that were now visibly shaking. Jonas checked the rope connections one final time and began the descent. The route down was steeper than Marcus had anticipated. The ice was more fractured. In places, the surface had developed a deceptive crust that looked solid but crumbled under weight. Twice, Marcus had to find new paths as the route he had chosen collapsed beneath them. The light was becoming something that couldn't be called light anymore. It was absence with just enough residual illumination to see shapes but not details, to perceive silhouettes but not hazards. They were navigating by headlamps now, the beams cutting through the darkness in narrow cones that seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than less dark. Sound became their primary sense. The scrape of crampons, the clink of carabiners, the sound of breathing, the groan of ice. And beneath it all, deeper, that sound like the glacier was singing, or screaming, or communicating in some language that predated human presence on this island by millions of years. David lost his footing again. This time, when he stumbled, he went down. His fall was arrested by the rope, but only just. He hung for a moment against the ice wall, gasping, his light bouncing wildly, and when he found his footing again and pulled himself back up, his breathing was ragged, desperate, the sound of someone who had just touched the edge of their panic and found it rushing toward them. Marcus called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the darkness. He said that David was doing fine, that they were almost at the bottom, that he should focus on the next step, just the next step, nothing more. The encouragement was automatic, the kind of thing a leader said because it was expected, because maintaining morale was part of the job. But even as he spoke, Marcus was aware that the situation had degraded, that they were now operating in conditions that pushed beyond the safety margin he had calculated. Elena, climbing between Marcus and Jonas, asked if they should consider a retreat. She phrased it carefully, not as a criticism, but as a question, as someone presenting a hypothesis for consideration. Marcus responded that retreat in darkness was more dangerous than forward progress, that they were committed now, that the best survival strategy was to reach the lower section of the glacier where they could properly assess their situation and establish an emergency camp if needed. Jonas didn't object. He simply climbed, moving steadily, his movements economical and focused. There was something reassuring about watching Jonas operate under pressure. He was afraid. Marcus could tell by the tension in his movements, by the way his breathing was controlled and deliberate, but fear wasn't stopping him. Jonas simply accommodated fear and continued. The descent seemed to take forever. In reality, it was perhaps 90 minutes, but time was negotiating with them now, extending moments into eternities, compressing hours into breaths. The landscape began to change. The ice became less fractured. The slope gentled. They were approaching the lower section of the glacier, the more stable zone. They were close. Marcus could feel it. They would make camp here, they would rest, and in the morning they would reassess. Everything would become clearer in daylight. Everything would make sense again. They just had to hold on for the next few hours, just had to survive the darkness. And then, the glacier would release them, and they could descend to the base where rescue was possible, where the outside world was accessible again. Elena was 10 meters below Marcus when the ice gave way. There was no warning sound, no indication of structural failure. The surface simply ceased to exist. The ice beneath her feet opened like a mouth, and she fell, and the rope connecting her to Marcus went taut with a force that yanked him forward toward the crevasse, his crampons scraping against ice as he tried to arrest her fall, as the full weight of her body hung from the rope, pulling him inevitably toward the darkness. Time fractured. The world became a series of disconnected moments. Elena, suspended in the crevasse, her headlamp pointing downward into nothing. Marcus, braced against the ice, every muscle contracted, trying to hold the rope despite the weight. Jonas, instantly moving to create a secondary anchor, his hands moving with desperate speed. David, standing at the edge of the crevasse, looking down at the darkness that had almost taken Elena, and understanding with sudden clarity that the glacier could open at any moment, that the surface beneath any of them could fail, that there was nothing actually holding them up except luck and the willingness of the ice to continue supporting their weight. Marcus called down. He asked if Elena was hurt. Elena's voice came up from the darkness, small and controlled, saying she was okay, she was caught, the rope was holding, but she couldn't see a bottom to the crevasse. It was just darkness beneath her, going down. Jonas had anchored himself and was already beginning to set up a mechanical advantage system to haul Elena back up. It would take time. It would require effort. But it was possible. The rope would hold. They would pull her out. This was a recoverable situation. That was when David made a sound. Not words, but a sound of pure animal fear. He was looking at the ice beneath his feet. Small cracks were spreading. Across the surface in a spiderweb pattern, radiating from the main crevasse, fracturing the remaining intact ice. The whole section was unstable. It was going to collapse. Marcus grabbed David and pulled him away from the edge, moving both of them back toward Jonas's position. The movement saved David's life. The ice where David had been standing gave way 30 seconds later, opening a secondary chasm, a section of the glacier reorganizing itself, erasing ground. Elena called up from the darkness. She said that she could feel movement, that the rope was shifting, that something was happening to the crevasse walls around her. Jonas, bent over his anchor work, looked up and said something in Danish that might have been a prayer or a curse, or simply an acknowledgement that their situation had changed, that they were no longer a team successfully managing risk, but a survival group dealing with cascading failures. Marcus made a calculation. The hauling would take time, perhaps 30 or 40 minutes, and even as they hauled, more sections might fail. Alternative, leave Elena and attempt to move everyone to higher ground, find a place that felt more solid, establish a secure position, and then figure out the recovery from there. He called down to Elena. He said that they needed to establish a secure anchor point, that they were going to move upslope to find better ice, that they would secure themselves and then figure out the best way to pull her up. Elena said she understood, that she was okay, that they should do whatever they needed to do. The three of them, Marcus, Jonas, and David, moved back up the slope, away from the cascading failures, looking for ice that felt solid, that didn't sound hollow when they tested it. The slope was steep. The darkness was now absolute except for their headlamps. David was shaking so badly that Jonas had to support him, keeping him anchored to the rope, keeping him moving. They found a section where a buried ice block created a natural platform. Marcus drove in 2 ice screws, creating redundant anchors, and secured all 3 of them to the anchors. Then he sent Jonas back down to attempt the hauling while Marcus monitored Elena from above, and David sat on the platform, wrapped in his own jacket and Marcus's emergency blanket, trying to control his breathing. Jonas descended back to the crevasse with a mechanical advantage system, a series of pulleys and carabiners designed to magnify force. But retrieving Elena wasn't simple. Her weight, combined with the friction of the rope across the ice edges of the crevasse, created enormous resistance. Jonas could barely move her, inch by inch, pulling her toward the surface while calling down encouragement, while Elena pulled herself upward, climbing the rope, trying to assist the process. It took an hour. Elena emerged from the darkness covered in ice, her equipment damaged, her left arm possibly injured, her face showing the strain of an hour spent, hanging over a void. She collapsed on the platform next to David, gasping, and Marcus immediately began assessing her injuries. The arm wasn't broken, just badly bruised. Her ribs hurt when she breathed deeply, but ribs were often bruised after trauma, and usually weren't serious. She was alive. She was intact. She was on solid ice again. For perhaps 5 minutes, no one spoke. There was just the sound of breathing, ragged and desperate, the sound of people who had just stared at death and were trying to adjust to still being alive. Then Elena asked if they were descending further or attempting to go back up. The question was practical, posed in a voice that was carefully neutral, despite everything that had happened. Marcus looked at the landscape visible in their headlamp beams, the maze of fractured ice, the crevasses that seemed to branch in all directions, the surface that was demonstrably unstable. He looked at David, who was now sitting with his eyes closed, his entire body still, shaking. He looked at Jonas, who was breathing heavily from the physical effort of hauling Elena, whose expression showed exhaustion and something else, something that might have been anger. Marcus said they would continue down. The descent was still the safest option. Going back up through the unstable sections they had already crossed was likely to result in another fall. Better to descend toward the glacier's outer edge where the ice was thicker, older, more stable. They just had to hold on. For another few hours. Dawn was coming. It was impossible to believe that the sun was still coming, that the earth was still rotating, that daylight would eventually return. They moved slowly, testing every step, moving together as a unit, leaving no margin for error. The terrain continued to shift around them. Twice more, sections of ice collapsed just behind them, or just to the side of them, the glacier rearranging itself like a vast living thing, slowly digesting the intrusion of these 4 humans who had wandered into its body. David began to deteriorate. His movements became mechanical and slow. His responses to instructions became delayed. Marcus recognized the symptoms: shock, fatigue, the weight of sustained terror compressing his mental state into something smaller and more fragile. At one point, David stopped moving entirely and simply sat down on the ice and said that he couldn't continue, that he was done, that everything hurt. Jonas picked him up physically, got him to his feet, and kept him moving. There was no gentleness in this, just pragmatism. Stop moving, and the cold would claim him. Stop moving, and he would lose all will to survive. So Jonas moved him, and David came along because resistance required energy he no longer possessed. The slope continued to descend. The landscape began to change again. The fractured surface was giving way to something older, ice that had been compressed for decades, centuries perhaps. The color was different here, darker, more opaque, with a quality that suggested it had been through transformations, had been subjected to pressures that had squeezed out all the air, that had made it something hard and dense and eternal. And then, without any clear transition, they were at the glacier's edge. The landscape opened up in front of them. Black rock was visible, patches of earth where the glacier had receded, exposed ground that hadn't seen daylight in years. Behind them, the glacier's interior was invisible now, lost in darkness. They had emerged. The relief lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then Elena realized that she couldn't move her left leg. The pain in her ribs was worse than she had initially admitted. David was barely conscious, his body continuing forward on momentum alone. Jonas was showing signs of profound exhaustion, his movements becoming slower, his attention fragmenting. Marcus consulted his GPS. The device was functional again now that they were away from the glacier's interior interference. They were 7 kilometers from the trailhead where they had left their base camp. 7 kilometers across unstable terrain in the dark. It was impossible. But staying here was also impossible. The cold was absolute. The wind was cutting. Without the glacier's protection, such as it was, they were fully exposed to conditions that would kill them systematically, one by one, as hypothermia progressed through its stages. Marcus made a decision. He said he would hike out, reach the base camp, and return, with proper rescue equipment. He would leave Jonas to maintain the group, to keep them alive until he could return. It was a plan that had obvious flaws. He would have to move in near-total darkness across unstable terrain. He might not make the distance. He might get lost. But it was the only option that had any possibility of success. Jonas didn't object. Elena said that Marcus was insane if he thought she was staying here, that she could walk, that she could make it. Marcus explained that he needed Elena to stay because her knowledge of their location and condition could help coordinate rescue if something went wrong, if he didn't make it. Marcus unclipped himself from the team rope, leaving the connection to Jonas, who would maintain the connection between himself, Elena, and David. He took a headlamp with limited battery, a water bottle, and emergency rations. Everything else he left behind. His climbing equipment, most of his weight. Jonas shook Marcus's hand. The gesture was almost formal, the kind of thing soldiers do before battle, before the final action that might separate them forever. Jonas said to stay safe out there, not as if Marcus had a choice in the matter, but as a benediction, as a prayer disguised as an instruction. David was barely conscious and said nothing. Elena gripped Marcus's sleeve and said they had better see him again, that she wasn't interested in any dramatic sacrifice plays, that he needed to survive this so they could all get out of it, together. Marcus began hiking. The initial terrain was rockier, less slippery. He moved quickly, covering perhaps a kilometer in the first hour. His headlamp illuminated a path forward, but the beam seemed inadequate to the darkness around him. The Icelandic landscape was alien and harsh, black rock, sparse vegetation, the edges of the glacier visible behind him when he turned around, a pale shape against the black sky. But he was making progress. At this pace, he could reach the base camp in 6 hours, maybe 5. He would get there. He would get his team. He would get out. The 3rd hour of his hike, the headlamp failed. The battery, degraded by the extreme cold, lost all ability to function. Marcus found himself in darkness so complete that he couldn't see his own feet, could only feel his way forward, testing the ground with each step. He slowed down. He continued forward. He told himself that the camp was still ahead, that he just had to maintain direction, that the terrain would eventually become familiar, that his eyes would adjust to the darkness. But eyes don't adjust to absolute darkness. There is no light to process. And when Marcus tripped on a rock he couldn't see and fell, he fell hard, his shoulder striking the ground with a force that sent pain radiating through his arm. He lay there for a moment, gasping, cataloging his injuries. Shoulder dislocated maybe, or broken. Either way, significant. He pulled himself up using his right arm and continued forward. The pain was enormous and very real. The pain meant he was alive. Time became strange again. He might have been hiking for minutes or hours. The darkness made it impossible to judge. At some point, he realized he was no longer sure which direction was forward, which direction was back. The landscape around him was featureless in the absolute black. The glacier behind him was invisible. The stars above him were covered by clouds. Marcus sat down. He told himself that sitting down was temporary, that he would rest for a few moments and then continue. But every moment that passed was a moment closer to dawn, a moment when the sun would reappear and daylight would return and he would be able to see again. He thought about his apartment in Seattle, about the apartment that had felt small and confining when he was there, about the way he had itched to escape it, to get back to the mountains, to get back to the ice. He thought about Sarah, his ex-wife, and her message. Be careful out there. He thought about how he had smiled and not responded, how he had been so certain that careful was for people who doubted themselves. The cold was getting worse. Marcus was shaking, deep shaking that came from his core, that made his teeth chatter audibly. He was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia. He knew what was coming. He knew how this ended if he continued sitting. He pulled himself to his feet. He began walking forward, moving in what he hoped was the direction of the camp. Moving. Because stopping meant dying, meant leaving Jonas and Elena and David alone on that glacier edge, meant failing at the one responsibility he had taken on when he had decided to lead this expedition. He walked until the sun came back. It appeared first as a lessening of the absolute black, a gradation toward gray, then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the landscape emerged from the darkness. The black rocks became visible. The sparse vegetation took on definition. The glacier behind him was suddenly present again, a vast pale shape against the black of the rocky terrain. And ahead, perhaps 2 kilometers away, Marcus could see the base camp. The tents were still there. The equipment was there. He had made it. He staggered into the camp and used the satellite phone to call for rescue. He explained the situation to the person who answered, a dispatcher in Reykjavik, speaking English with an accent that suggested she came from somewhere other than Iceland. Marcus reported 3 people, stranded on the glacier's edge, one of them with possible injuries, all of them in need of immediate evacuation. The dispatcher said that rescue helicopters couldn't fly at night, that they would launch at first light, that Marcus needed to provide the exact coordinates of the stranded group. Marcus used the GPS to determine the coordinates as precisely as possible. The dispatcher said that rescue would arrive around 7 a.m., that Marcus should try to rest until then. Marcus didn't try to rest. He prepared hot drinks and warm clothes. He checked the emergency supplies. He stared at the glacier and thought about Jonas and Elena and David, still out there in the darkness, waiting for dawn, waiting for rescue that would come if everything went according to plan. The rescue helicopter arrived at 7:15 a.m. It was a twin-rotor aircraft, red and white, impossibly loud in the quiet of the Icelandic morning. The helicopter descended toward Marcus's position, the downdraft from the rotors nearly knocking him backward. 2 rescue personnel descended on ropes, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They assessed Marcus quickly: dislocated shoulder, severe exhaustion, early-stage hypothermia, but functional. They loaded him into the helicopter and immediately began coordinating with the ground team to locate Jonas, Elena, and David. The flight to the glacier's edge took 8 minutes. From the air, the landscape looked different. The glacier was revealed. In its entirety, a vast expanse of white and blue and shadow, fractal patterns of crevasses visible from above, the scale of it suddenly apparent in a way it hadn't been while navigating its interior. The helicopter descended toward the location Marcus had provided, circling, searching for the 3 stranded climbers. They found them on a dark patch of exposed rock, a small formation that provided minimal shelter. From the air, they looked like dots, like insects, like things so small that it seemed impossible they had survived the night. Jonas was standing, his posture rigid, watching the helicopter. Elena was sitting, her leg extended in front of her. David appeared motionless. The rescue personnel descended on ropes again. They worked quickly, assessing each climber, preparing them for extraction. Elena was lifted first, her injuries evaluated by the medical personnel in the helicopter. David came next, his condition worse than the others. Severe hypothermia, shock, his body having begun the process of shutting down, conserving energy, preparing for death. Jonas was last, and when he reached the helicopter, he grabbed Marcus's shoulder with one hand, gripping it hard, his eyes meeting Marcus's for just a moment before releasing him and slumping into a seat. The helicopter banked away from the glacier. They climbed, gaining altitude, and the glacier receded below them, becoming smaller, becoming something that could be viewed from a distance, that could be understood as a place existing in the landscape, rather than as the entire world. The rescue flight took them to a hospital in Reykjavik. Elena's injuries turned out to be a fractured tibia and severe bruising. David spent 3 days in the intensive care unit, his core temperature having dropped dangerously low, his body having essentially begun the process of shutting down before rescue arrived. But his youth and strength pulled him through. Within a week, all 3 were medically cleared for release. Marcus's shoulder required surgery. The dislocation had caused additional damage to the joint, and the extreme cold had exacerbated the injury. He spent longer in the hospital than the others, and when he was finally released, he was informed that his climbing days were likely finished. The shoulder might never regain full functionality, The pain would probably be permanent. On the day Marcus was discharged, Gunnar came to visit him. The old guide walked into the hospital room with the same weathered expression he had worn at their initial meeting, and he pulled a chair close to Marcus's bed and sat down without being invited to do so. Gunnar said that he had been thinking about what happened, that he had examined the satellite images from the past few weeks, and that the glacier's instability had been even worse than he had initially realized. Gunnar said that Marcus's team had been lucky. Gunnar said that luck was the only thing that separated them from being four bodies that would never be recovered, that would remain in the glacier for years or decades or centuries, that would eventually emerge at the glacier's terminus, unrecognizable and anonymous. Marcus asked Gunnar why he was telling him this. Gunnar said that sometimes people needed to hear the full weight of how close they had come, that sometimes survival wasn't redemptive, wasn't transformative, but was simply luck, and that understanding that distinction might matter. Jonas and Elena and Marcus met for breakfast 3 days after Marcus's discharge. They sat in a cafe in downtown Reykjavik, the same cafe where they had met Gunnar before the expedition, and they didn't speak much. Elena had her leg in a cast. Marcus had his arm in a sling. Jonas looked at the two of them and asked what they were going to do now. Elena said she wasn't climbing anymore. She said that photographing glaciers from the ground level, from the safe zones, was sufficient. She had pushed far enough, and now she was going to spend her time on projects that didn't require her to gamble with her life. David didn't attend the breakfast. He had returned to his geology studies, but he had stopped climbing. The trauma of the experience had altered something fundamental in him, had made mountains seem hostile in a way they hadn't before. Jonas said that he would climb again, that he couldn't not climb, that the mountains were part of him in a way that was difficult to articulate, but he said he would be different. He would respect the warnings. He would listen to the locals. He would understand that experience wasn't immunity to failure. Marcus didn't answer when Jonas asked what he would do. The answer wasn't clear yet. The idea of not climbing felt like a death in itself, but the physical reality of his shoulder, the certainty that he would never climb at the level he had before, made continuing seem futile. He was suspended in a liminal space, neither climber nor non-climber, unable to move fully in either direction. Before they left the cafe, Elena placed a hand on Marcus's hand and said that he needed to understand that his arrogance had nearly killed them all, that the warning from Gunnar hadn't been the opinion of someone timid or outdated, but the knowledge of someone who had lived long enough to understand the limits of human capability. Elena said that Marcus needed to change, not because he had survived, but because he had almost caused the deaths of 3 people who had trusted him to make intelligent decisions. Marcus said that he understood, but understanding and accepting are not the same thing, and it would take years, longer than any of them expected, before Marcus could truly integrate the lessons of those 3 days on the glacier into a new understanding of what courage actually meant. The investigation into the incident came from the Icelandic authorities. They interviewed all 4 climbers separately. They examined equipment, analyzed weather records, studied the satellite imagery of the glacier's condition. Their conclusion was that the expedition had been inadequately planned for the actual conditions present, that the decision to continue deeper despite mounting evidence of instability constituted reckless behavior, and that the team had been extraordinarily fortunate to survive. The investigation also noted that Gunnar Einarsson, the local guide, had specifically warned against the expedition and had recommended waiting for conditions to improve. This warning, the investigation concluded, should have been heeded. 6 months after the incident, Marcus returned to Iceland. He didn't climb. He hired a guide and visited Gunnar at his home, a small house overlooking a valley where multiple glaciers were visible in the distance. They sat on the porch, looking at those glaciers, and Marcus said that Gunnar had been right, that the warning had been based on genuine expertise and genuine care for their safety, not on timidity or outdated thinking. Gunnar said that he was glad they had survived, that he had worried about them every moment they were on the glacier, that he had felt responsible in a way that older people sometimes do when younger people don't listen to their warnings. Gunnar said that the glaciers were beautiful, but that beauty and danger were often inseparable, and that learning to respect both required humility. Marcus asked Gunnar if the glacier was still changing, still becoming more unstable. Gunnar said that it was, that climate change was accelerating the process, that in a few years or decades, the areas they had attempted to traverse would probably be impassable, that the glacier was receding, dying slowly, and that perhaps it was appropriate that humans rarely survived attempts to penetrate its interior. A year after the incident, Elena published her photographs in a magazine article titled "The Beauty That Kills." The images showed the glacier in all its terrible magnificence: the blue ice, cathedral, the crevasse fields, the light playing across the surface in ways that suggested something living and conscious. The article didn't sensationalize the accident. Instead, it examined the human drive to witness beauty, even when witnessing required risk, even when risk meant potentially dying. David never returned to climbing, but he did finish his geology degree. He wrote his thesis on glacial dynamics and climate change, using his experience on Vatnajökull as a case study. He is now a glaciologist, studying the same formations that nearly killed him, understanding them now through the lens of science rather than through the lens of survival. Jonas continued climbing, but he became known for a different approach. He began working with local guides in the mountains he climbed, genuinely partnering with them rather than hiring them as secondary support. He started a climbing school that emphasized decision-making and risk assessment, and one of the core teachings of his school was the value of respecting warnings from people with local knowledge. Marcus never climbed again. His shoulder never fully healed. He developed osteoarthritis in the joint, and the pain became a constant companion, a reminder of those 3 days on the glacier. He returned to Seattle and worked for a climbing equipment company, designing safety gear, using his experience to inform products that might help other climbers avoid the mistakes he had made. 5 years after the incident, Marcus and Elena and Jonas met again in Reykjavik. They didn't discuss the glacier much, but they did visit Gunnar together, bringing with them a thank you gift and the understanding that Gunnar's warning, ignored so many years before, had been the truest thing any of them had heard before descending. Gunnar accepted the visit with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen the pattern before. Young people ignoring advice, facing consequences, eventually understanding that experience means less than humility. As they left his home, looking back at the glaciers visible in the distance, Marcus realized that the glacier had taught him something that no amount of climbing success ever could have. The glacier had taught him that confidence without wisdom is just arrogance wearing climbing gear. The glacier had taught him that warnings deserve respect. The glacier had taught him that survival isn't victory, sometimes it's just luck, and the only intelligent response to luck is gratitude and change. The Vatnajökull Glacier continues to recede. Each year, it shrinks further. The ice formations that exist today will be gone in a decade. The crevasse field that nearly claimed Elena has collapsed entirely. The route that Marcus attempted to traverse is no longer passable. The glacier has reorganized itself to such an extent that the path exists only in memory and in the GPS records of that terrible expedition. Sometimes, when Marcus experiences a moment of pain in his shoulder, when the cold weather exacerbates the old injury and reminds him of those nights on the ice, he thinks about Gunnar's words. He thinks about how the glaciers are dying, how they are being erased by a warming world, how within a century or two, Vatnajökull might be nothing but bare rock and memory. And he thinks about how that might be merciful, how it might prevent other people from making the decisions he made, how it might prevent other teams from ignoring the warnings of people who understand that some beauty is best appreciated from a distance, and that the deepest lessons about courage aren't learned on summits or in the depths of glaciers, but in the moment you finally understand that turning back is not failure, it's wisdom. The glacier remains, beautiful and deadly, a monument to the power of nature and the fragility of human certainty. And those who visit it now, who stand at its edges or venture into its interior, carry with them the story of 4 people who descended into ice and emerged transformed by the understanding that some warnings are not obstacles to overcome, but gifts to respect. In the end, the glacier doesn't ask for conquest. It asks only to be respected. And those who learn that lesson survive. Those who don't become part of the ice, becoming part of something vast and ancient and indifferent to human ambition. That is the story the glacier tells, if anyone listens carefully enough to hear it.